So I want to kick things off with how you got into public service. Both of you, I think, are what I would call unpoliticians. You never ran a campaign before this one. You never served an elected office. And I think both of you had upset wins, especially Mike during the primary, maybe a little bit in the general, and certainly Stephanie during the general. You beat an incumbent member of Congress. So to start with Congresswoman Murphy, tell us more about why you decided to get involved in public service and ultimately run for office.
Well, I'm very deeply patriotic, and it's because of my personal story. I was 6 months old, and when my parents and I got on a boat to escape communist Vietnam, we got to sea and ran out of fuel, and a U.S. Navy ship came upon us like in this vast South China Sea, and they refueled us and resupplied us, and it allowed us to get to a Malaysian refugee camp. And so we were relocated by a Lutheran church to the United States, and I have, a lot of people say it's lived the American dream, right? The opportunity to grow up in the greatest country in the world and go get a college education, be the first woman in my family to graduate from college. And I initially went into the private sector as a strategy consultant. And when 9/11 happened, I just felt that call to public service, right? I had been the beneficiary of so many great opportunities. And here was a country that I loved was under attack. So I left my private sector job and went into work for the Department of Defense as a national security specialist. And then, I moved to Florida and went back to the private sector after having some time in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Really one of the greatest honors in my life to be able to work alongside the uniformed men and women who keep this country safe, knowing that they had rescued my family so many years before. But moving to Florida, I went back to the private sector and was listening to the rhetoric of this last campaign, and it just didn't comport with the America I knew. And sort of the tipping point for me was when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened and affected my community. And I felt like, words have power, and you can't have a government that is so partisan and so dysfunctional and not moving forward, and have people speaking very divisive rhetoric and not expect it to manifest itself in your own communities. And so I did kind of a crazy thing, or brave, as some people would say. And I got into the race about a year ago this time, which meant that I ran a 4-month campaign to unseat a 24-year incumbent. And that's how I'm here.
I think you skipped over a few steps. But Congressman, I know you have been working in the national security space. From our prior conversations, you were not necessarily like plotting out a run for Congress, happened unexpectedly. So tell us more about how you decided to ultimately run and get involved.
Sure, absolutely. I have followed that. Yeah, when I was 6, I was like on a boat in Green Bay, like delivering pizza from my family's restaurant. I never thought I'd be doing something like this ever. I was a policy guy, and 2 years ago I was working on the Walker campaign as the national security advisor. And at the time I started, we were kind of up here in the polls. I thought there was a good chance I'd be doing national security work in a Republican administration. But when that ended, I stayed in Wisconsin. My family's in Wisconsin. I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I just wanted to be near my family. And I was working in the private sector at an energy and supply chain management company. I was getting ready to teach at a local university. I'd been fortunate enough to use my GI Bill to get my PhD. And our sitting congressman decided to retire unexpectedly, a little bit early. And people reached out to me to see if I was interested. And at first I thought, no way. I'm a policy nerd. I'm the guy you lock in a closet and never let on camera or talk to the press ever. And but the more I thought about it, I just sort of reflected on the last 10 years of my life. I graduated college in 2006. I'd studied the Middle East. I'd studied Arabic, and that led me to join the Marine Corps. I ended up doing 7 years in active duty. I deployed to Iraq 2007, 2008. I was part of the surge. I got to see the surge work firsthand. I was deployed to a town called El Qaim on the Syrian border, and I sort of watched it go from pretty much chaos to relative order and stability. And I remember returning when I was working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the Middle East guy, and seeing that portion of Iraq was now under ISIS control. The town that I left in stability in 2008, where we were walking around without our helmets, without our protective gear. We couldn't find a fight. By the end of it, was now under ISIS control, and that was very troubling to me. And just seeing the broader slide of our position in the Middle East, and we can argue about why that is, and there's bipartisan failures on foreign policy, and I think a need for a bipartisan consensus moving forward. But I just felt like I could put some of this experience to good use, and I had no clue if I could get anywhere when I decided to step into the ring and run. I had 1% name ID, and that was all Gallagher's Pizza name ID in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And even that, I mean, why would you name a pizza joint Gallagher's Pizza? The Irish are not known for their pizza making abilities. I got in, and it was great. A lot of really great people supported me, and it was a year where, if you worked hard and you kind of, I think if you're just honest, people really responded to that. I think people are kind of tired of just the talking points politics that we live in, and they don't expect you to agree with them 100% of the time, but if you're honest and you're willing to have that discussion and you perceive that you're trying to do the right thing, that'll get you a long way. And so it's an honor to even be here. Thank you guys for what you're doing. I do think there's a need for a different model going forward. My working hypothesis is that kind of both parties have been talking from the same scripts for the last 3 decades, and some of it still works, a lot of it doesn't, and there's at the very least a need to have an honest and open conversation about very complex policy issues. And if both sides are being honest, they would suggest there often is no easy silver bullet solution to some of these complex issues we face, and it's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of courage, and a lot of open-mindedness to move forward for our generation. So as one of the 3 millennials in Congress, I appreciate you guys stepping up and being engaged.
Absolutely. Well, let's pick up on a theme that you had, I think, during the campaign, both of you had, which is the need for a new generation of leadership, the need to get over the partisanship, the stagnant ways of thinking in Congress. Why is it important for us to be supporting this new generation of leadership? Maybe I'll throw that to you, Congresswoman. What do we need that Congress doesn't have right now as you diagnose the problems, and what type of new mindset do you hope that you're able to bring with kind of a fresh way of doing things?
Well, I would echo what Mike said about honest conversation and authenticity in politics, which I think in a lot of places are sorely lacked. What I always tell people is that, I don't expect to agree with them 100% of the time. I've been married for 15 years, and on a good day, we're at 25%, And so, but my door is always open for conversation. And so one is about the approach of moving forward ideas regardless of whether they're Democratic ideas or Republican ideas, so long as they're ideas that advance the best interests of the American people and my constituents. And then the other piece for the younger generation is that so much of what we are facing is about a change that I worry a little bit that some of my more mature, seasoned colleagues don't quite understand, in the sense that they have a hard time controlling their phone and having Siri interrupt meetings. But what the challenges we're looking at is about the innovative economy, and what does the future of work look like, and how do you engage millennials who are currently a third of the workforce but are going to be 50% of the workforce by 2020. The world is shifting, and so much of the legislating that's being done is about the past as opposed to being forward-thinking. And I think that's an opportunity for younger members to bring their experiences, especially like Mike, who's been in the private sector, myself, bringing those experiences to this process of lawmaking is really important and a real opportunity.
Yeah. One thing you talked about, Congressman, during your campaign was you didn't want to you weren't going to poll test your positions or messages, and you've made reform, I think, one of the big pieces of your agenda, and you don't typically see Republicans talking about nonpartisan redistricting. You recently had an op-ed with Congressman Khanna, bipartisan op-ed, talking about how we need to fix a broken political system. So tell us more about some of those ideas behind your reform agenda. I thought the redistricting one was interesting. You talked about closing the revolving door. One thing you'd mentioned to me once was, it's tough to legislate in a broken system. Mm-hmm. So how do you describe the problem and the fixes?
Well, kind of like the premise of your question, you brought up polling. So all right, you raise an ungodly sum of money to run for Congress. I mean, I'm in a single media market, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Northeast Wisconsin. It's not as expensive as your district. Even then, it cost $3 million, right? And all that money spent on all these things, which I just think there's got to be a better way of doing business. And polling's a perfect example, right? I mean, you pay thousands of dollars for a poll, and it comes back and it says, well, the voters really like that you were in the military. I'm like, wow, okay, good, I knew that. They're concerned about national security and the spread of ISIS, and they want jobs and the economy. It's just, I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say is like when we're spending $50 million on a race in Georgia, are we confident that that money is being efficiently spent or that it couldn't be used elsewhere? I do think there's some innovation happening naturally outside the political system. What CrowdPack is doing is really interesting to me, and I've had some conversations with them. Really, it's only on the Democratic side that's taking advantage of that, and I think we as Republicans would be dumb not to see if we can do it as well. But on congressional reform, some of it's obvious and has been talked about for years, and I just think it's an idea whose time's come. Like term limits, I believe strongly in term limits. I understand the principled opposition to them, but I've sort of gone through this in various intellectual exercises, and I just think it would be a good way of just ending the constant careerism and the endless, I'm going to position myself to be a subcommittee chair in 20 years, and then maybe from there I'll run for Senate. I just do think that's a problem. And something that my predecessor said to me really hit home. He said, because he knew he wasn't going to stay, he said, because of that, every day I showed up to work, I knew I had one less day to make a difference, and I just worked way harder as a result. And I think it's very easy to get in this mindset of getting comfortable with being in DC and having that long, sort of career mindset. I don't think service in Congress should be a career. Nonpartisan redistricting, I just sort of believe the simple principle that politicians shouldn't be able to choose their districts. I know there's a variety of contentious legal cases going on right now. I'm not going to comment on sort of the legal complexities contained therein, but just on that principle alone, I think we'd be better off with nonpartisan redistricting. Obviously, I'm in a swing district, so maybe that's easier for me to say. And even if you drew it in a nonpartisan way or had some algorithm, there'd be some heavily Republican and heavily Democratic districts. I thought the op-ed by Rayhan Salam this last week was really interesting, where he talked about, we have a Marine from Maine here, right? Oh, no, not a Marine, I'm conflating, yeah. A guy from Maine who's a Marine, yeah. So they do ranked choice voting in Maine, and he talked about pairing that with sort of at-large districts. I have to study it more, but I just think we need intriguing proposals like that, because I'm convinced that the way in which Congress operates is not the best. And I think the absence of regular order and the way in which we pass CRs and omnibuses is evidence of a broken system. So until we change the system, I don't know how we're going to have a chance of solving the really big issues that are looming on the horizon that Stephanie alluded to. I mean, the way in which automation is going to disrupt the workforce and has secondary and third order implications for our social safety net. We're not even talking about that.
That's right. And I just want to highlight, a lot of people in elected office will talk about ideas or state different positions. You've actually introduced a few of these things. You've introduced a resolution around term limits to amend the Constitution. You've introduced a bill to close the revolving door between Congress and lobbying shops. I think you have a 5-year prohibition.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You serve in Congress, you need to wait 5 years before becoming a lobbyist on federal issues. So I just want to highlight, this is real stuff that's turning into legislation. And on that topic, I'm going to continue on this line of areas where you've really reached across the partisan line. And Congresswoman, I think a couple weeks ago, you introduced a balanced budget amendment. Our generation is going to be inheriting national debt, and again, you don't typically hear Democrats talking about fiscal responsibility in that sense. Introducing a balanced budget amendment, I think, took a lot of courage. So maybe you can just tell the audience a little bit about why you decided to introduce that, and maybe some of the response you've been getting.
Well, so I really believe that some of this dysfunction that we're seeing is because Congress is unable to do their jobs. I mean, we have the power of the purse, right? And yet we're locked into these continuing resolutions, the Budget Control Act, artificial things that don't allow us to make prioritization and investments into what we believe the future is going to look like and address the needs of this country. And so the balanced budget amendment is a part of another bill, or not, about a part of a two-part piece to fiscal responsibility. I also support no budget, no pay. So if Congress doesn't pass a budget, they shouldn't get paid. And then with the balanced budget amendment, it's basically that, with the exception of war, recession, and with some protections for Social Security and Medicaid, that we should seek to have a balanced budget because the debt is getting dangerous. And the CBO just came out with a report about you just can't sustain that over time. And so while it doesn't restrict us to a balanced budget all the time, what it does is it makes it harder to run deficits. And that makes it a more deliberate decision by lawmakers to do so, right? As opposed to writing checks that, they, without necessarily thinking about consequences. And so that's really what I think those two proposals are about, is to try to get Congress back into regular order and doing its job as it relates to setting priorities and making investments.
Well, and Congressman Gallagher here has a Do Your Job Act, is that right? What's that about?
That one got me in trouble. So Do Your Job Act would basically tell Congress, restore regular order and pass the budget that balanced in 10 years, we wouldn't be able to take a recess. With the idea that, in Northeast Wisconsin, if you don't do your job, you don't take a vacation. I shouldn't say this, but so Mark, this was the week after the healthcare debate, and after the first round of the healthcare debate where it didn't go forward, and a prominent member of the Freedom Caucus, will say, who had been the subject of a lot of controversy, came up to me and said, I just want to thank you, because last week, I was the least popular member of Congress. This week, you are the least popular member of Congress. Listen, I do think, while it may not be congressional reform may not be popular with leadership, it resonates with the American people on the left and the right. I mean, I can talk about these things I was just at a parade in Door County, and I was talking about it with sort of very hardcore progressive citizens of my district, and we were all kind of speaking the same language. So I do think there are opportunities. Maybe we don't come together on healthcare or tax reform at the end of the day, although I do think there are certain aspects of those debates where bipartisanship can be had. I have a bipartisan bill on price transparency in healthcare, but there are a lot of areas where there's room to work together. We just passed NDAA out of committee a couple weeks ago on a 60-1 vote. So it doesn't always have to be we're just tearing each other apart.
Yeah, no, things are actually moving. I think the micro lending bill you had, actually, just maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, it's just the micro lending or micro loan modernization act. It's a way to make some changes to that micro loan program so that you can increase capital access for entrepreneurs and small businesses. But I think the part you're alluding to that's interesting about that is that I co-sponsored that with a Republican, and while we are ideologically maybe pretty far apart on some issues, we both agree that small businesses should be given greater access to capital and be able to be supported to grow and create jobs and help grow the economy. So I think 5 of my 9 bills are co-sponsored with a Republican leads, because that's the way you get things done, and we're finding a lot of common ground, whether that's in small business or in the national security space or in innovation, and I think that doesn't necessarily transmit so much if you watch the news or read the papers.
Yeah. Well, I think so much of what we see in the news is reason for why so many millennials are feeling disaffected from the process right now.
Yeah.
And part of, I think, what we're trying to achieve here with the Millennial Action Project is to change that narrative. Not in some kind of empty messaging vehicle, but with real leadership and real legislation that both of you are working on. And I'll just I know we're getting to the end of our time here, because actually both of our members have to go back and vote and do their job and live everything that they've been talking about. But for me, it's really inspiring because I get to work with leaders like Stephanie and Mike on a daily basis who are actively countering what we see in the headlines every single day. And you're not, again, like I said earlier, not just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk. I mean, we don't have time to really get into this, but our Congressional Future Caucus co-chair, Congressman Carlos Cabral, has been very active on climate change issues, a Republican from Florida. and Congressman Gallagher here recently joined the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. It's one thing to join that caucus as a member of Congress from Florida. It's another thing to join it from Wisconsin. No, seriously, this is a big deal. And at a time when political courage is in such short supply, we're seeing it right here from our vice chairs. Let's give them a big round of applause. Okay, sorry. I thought I was getting the... Okay, great. So we actually do have time for 2 questions.
I trust there's someone who's just going to pull us out.
Excellent. Sorry, I was trying to be on time, but we actually do have a couple. Any questions that we have in the audience? Yes, in the back.
Would you ever consider running as an unenrolled or unaffiliated individual for your current job?
So, so I actually was a no-party affiliate before I decided to run for this seat. And, you know, I think a lot of reform has to happen just because of the way the system is set up. You know, having explored what it would look like to run as a no-party affiliate was a challenge. But what I will say to you is that millennials, and I recognize this, millennials register as no-party affiliates in increasingly greater numbers. And like, looking at the political situation now, no wonder. Who wants to affiliate with, you know, some of the stuff that we're seeing, right? And so I understand that, but the one thing I would say, though, is that my request of you all, and I'm grateful to see so many of you here, is that, you know, our democracy depends on engaged citizens. So call yourselves whatever you want, no party affiliate, Democrat, Republican, but don't disengage, right? Show up, come talk to your representatives, run for public office, support people who are running for public office, but don't be turned off by the system, the way it's built, and disengage from this, because I think that's the biggest danger to our democracy. And so, I mean, that's a, didn't quite answer your question, but
I think, I mean, what you guys are doing in Maine will be a really interesting experiment as to whether these different models are viable on the national stage. Obviously, we had, so I think it's 2012 when Americans Elect tried to do a third-party candidate for president, ran into some hurdles. Ballot access wasn't a problem, but debate access was actually the biggest problem, and they've learned a lot of really interesting lessons. So I think it will happen eventually. For me, I kind of like the way Ben Sass put it, where he said, you know, I'm an American first, a conservative second, and a Republican third. Or someone else put it as, I'm a conservative who chooses to caucus with the Republicans because my principles come first. For me, it's, I'm an American, a Packers fan, and then a conservative and a Republican. So I do think if you get to a point where your party no longer embodies your principles, then you need to do some reflection. But I think there's got to be room for different parties. So hard, though. I mean, the barriers to entry are so hard. Even if you are affiliated with a party, you've never run before, and you can't raise money, it is so difficult. So if you guys can figure out how to lower the barriers to entry, we'd all be better off.
The reason that I ask is, being incumbents, you at least have that name recognition, you have some built-in infrastructure, resources, access to certain capital and things like that. So one of the things I like to do is ask folks that are currently lawmakers if they would consider utilizing their incumbent strengths to unaffiliate with their party and then make another stab at it separately.
Well, I do want to just recognize that we do have 2 independent lawmakers here in the back. We have O.M. Cassis and Jason Gren. If you guys can just raise your hand, awesome, and in the back there. So thank you guys so much for coming. Any other questions? Time for one more. Yes.
What are your thoughts about the aging leadership in Congress? I think everyone's just ready for new energy, new ideas. How do you feel about, I think, the average Democrat being 73 years?
I was going to toss it to him to answer. You know, I think there are a lot of ways to lead without having formal roles, right? So I feel like I have the background and experience to provide innovative ideas and smart and strong national security and innovative ideas in the small business and entrepreneurial space. And so I do. And one of the great things about being a member of Congress is not so much, I mean, there's the legislating piece, but the other piece is that you have a platform to get messages out there, to talk about issues. You have a convening power. So I can pull people together and regularly do to hear good new ideas and then try to turn that into some sort of action. And so I think there are a lot of ways to lead without actually being in a leadership position.
Can I just, I mean, we were on a bipartisan congressional delegation with the Armed Services Committee to Asia, and Stephanie was, speaking Vietnamese in Vietnam and interacting with all those high-level officials, and it's just, they've never seen a member of Congress do that. I mean, it was unbelievable. And so I think your background and your defense experience already puts you in a position where you can influence the debate, where someone would have to be here for 10 years before they even have that platform. And I do think, like Petraeus would always say in counterinsurgency, rank is nothing, talent is everything. And my experience as a staffer, sort of observing members of the Senate and how they operate on the Foreign Relations Committee, the ones that were really willing to roll up their sleeves and dig in and understand the policy and show up to hearings and do all the unglamorous dirty work, were able to have an impact. Now, it may not have been that moonshot piece of legislation like comprehensive tax reform, but it's stuff that really matters. And so, but part of the problem, we got to find a way to carve out the space and time for members to actually focus on policy and legislating as opposed to raising money or preparing for the next election. That's sort of the dynamic I think we need to break.
Do we have, okay, we have no more time,
First, tell me votes aren't going on.
I'm
definitely afraid of missing a vote.
Excellent. Well, let me just say thank you, first of all, to the Millennial Action Project staff. If you can just raise your hand from the MAP team, I know around the bar. Thank you guys so much for all of your help.